Welcome back to another edition of VADA Live. I'm your host, Dan Carrigan, coming to you from VADA's headquarters in downtown Richmond. And today we have a guest with us, Kevin Tynan, who is Director of Research at the Presidio Group. Kevin, welcome to VADA Live. How are you?
Well, doing great, Dan.
Well, Kevin, last time we checked in, a lot of dealers heard from you was the convention last year. And I'd love to really use that as a launching point to this conversation. But really, we're chatting. It's February 2025. Love to hear from you to start this segment. What is top of mind for you at this point, or maybe should be for dealers right now?
Yeah, and I think the things that get to me is we're back to sort of pre-pandemic, right? Mm. So those dynamics, and they were eye-opening, right? What lower volume but supply-demand balance meant for profitability for the manufacturers and for the dealers. And I think there was maybe 15 minutes of hope that would stick, right? That historically this has been a push model where manufacturers produce, and then to cover fixed costs, and then you figure out how to sell it to the consumer tomorrow. And you always do. The question is that a good deal or a bad deal from the manufacturer or the dealer's perspective? We went through that period in the pandemic where it was so easy, right? The supply was down, demand was reasonable still, so everything sold at sticker or over MSRP. And you wondered if that was going to be the world, and it isn't. So 2025 is really, I think, the first full year of the industry back to the way it was, that push model. And what does that mean for profitability throughout the value chain? And I have to say, it's not great, right? Like, when you rely on more volume, trying to find the demand to match with it, the thing that suffers in that model is margins and profitability, and I think that's where we are for 25.
One issue I want to dive into is just the major shifts. Are there any in how manufacturers are really leaning on dealers to just with that managing inventory and sales end of things?
Yeah, well, what you had is, again, because of all this natural production inflation, right? Raw material costs go up, labor costs go up, right through the line. And what you get, or what you had, was manufacturers moving up market, right? More trucks, fewer cars. So transaction prices were high. They're a record, so we're close to $49,000 average transaction price. And it became where, hey, inventory comes in early in the day, it's gone that afternoon. So I think there was this mindset from the manufacturers and maybe the media and even the consumers that said, oh, we could sell directly to the consumer and cut out the dealership. Not possible, not even easy, in terms of now you have to sell more units than ever to cover your cost at the highest transaction prices ever. And you need expertise and history and scale to do all that. And the only way to do that is through the franchise dealer base. The dealer base is healthy. When you look at throughput, right, average units per franchise, still very strong. The problem, I think, is on the manufacturing side. We have a lot of excess capacity, not just in North America and not for the U.S. market, but I think globally. And I think that's what sparks trade wars, is you're not selling your stuff here or pushing your stuff here. And I think that has to be realized and rationalized going forward. The problem is more with the manufacturing base for what I see going forward than it is the retail base.
What do you think is keeping the franchise model so resilient through all this?
Flexibility, really, and what I call revenue diversity, right? So if you think about a full-line franchise dealer, they're selling new vehicles, they're selling used vehicles, they're servicing parts for those vehicles, finance insurance for the consumer, after sales. So there's all these business units that enable a full-line dealer to say, hey, margin on new vehicles is declining. Let me do more pre-owned. Let me do more F&I, more fixed ops, service bays, that kind of thing. And what we had was, when supply and demand were in balance, the new vehicle market margins were great. right? So the dealers said, we'll do more of that. We'll do less pre-owned. Now we're starting to get to where the new vehicle market's a little bit oversupplied, margins are compressing, and the dealers have the ability to say, okay, where should we turn next? And it may be nuanced, but they have the ability to turn to the used vehicle market and say like, hey, let's make this work a little bit better while margins are compressing in new. Same thing. The automotive care market is huge, $400 billion or whatever it is, depending if you're including tires and all these other things, and the franchise base gets a small part of that. So if there's this push to say, hey, let's push into some of that customer pay business a little bit more, there's a lot of money and profitability on the line there if they're able to do it.
Appreciate that, Kevin. Turning to EVs, are you still seeing a cooling off in that EV market demand just compared to those initial projections? And really, how should dealers be thinking about their role with EVs, both sales and service?
Yeah, my take on EV was never from a demand perspective. It was always from a supply perspective. And what I mean is, if it's profitable, the manufacturers will build it. They will give it to the dealers to sell, and the consumer will buy it, right? People, and I speak to a lot of dealers, and a lot of people will say, well, the consumer decides. And I say, well, that may be true, but the consumer only decides based on the choices they're given by the manufacturer. So if you have a drivetrain technology or even a platform or a nameplate that doesn't make you money as a manufacturer, you don't put your heart and soul into it if you do it at all. Now, we may have pressure from the government or from markets to say, you need to do this, but it's not your best effort. And that's what we've seen over the past few years. So now, with the new administration, with the Trump administration in place, I feel like there's a little bit less financial pressure on the manufacturers being forced to do this. X% of your portfolio has to be electric, or this state isn't going to sell anything but electric by 2035. And as those sort of cool off, and I think markets, media, government see that the profitability isn't there, the demand isn't there, you have to walk back some of these targets, and I feel like that's where we are now. But EV was never anything about necessarily the technology. Yes, you don't have infrastructure in place, but I feel like it comes down to the supply side of that equation. A manufacturer saying, I don't care if there's federal tax credits for the consumer. I don't care if there's charging on every corner. I'm losing $15,000 every single one of these I build. I'm not going to do it, right? And that's where we are now. So I think those things are starting to align a little bit better now, where it says like, you don't have to do them. If you want to do them and you see that as access to a new customer base, and you're willing to lose that money, then you can go ahead and do it. But we're not going to make you do it anymore.
Appreciate that insight, Kevin. So parts and services continue to be a bright spot. Are there any strategies you've seen or reason really about dealers and just those that were successful in really maximizing fixed ops revenue? Any insight there?
Yeah, the thing about fixed ops that look, you have a relationship with the factory, and you think about proprietary software and diagnostic tools and processes. I feel like that as vehicles become more complex, that's going to be a bigger chunk of the business. Now, let me just say, when I think about parts and service, right, by revenue, it's not the largest segment. It's probably third behind new and used, but by gross profit, it's actually the largest, because you're talking about 50 to 60% gross margin in a service bay. New and used, you're lucky if you're getting into double digits, right? So you're doing a lot more with less in the parts and service part of the business. And I think will get more focus as the pre-owned market stays really tight and the new vehicle market gets oversupplied and margins compress. It's a place where dealers can go. And I don't have the answer on how you do this specifically.
Sure.
That's going to depend on the dealer and the region and everything else. But I think there's a huge opportunity there, because of vehicle complexity always increasing, and that inside track you have to processes and tools and diagnostics on that brand's vehicles.
Do you have any, just we'll say, forecast or insight into shifts in incentives, pricing, floor plan strategies, how they may change for dealers with the current state of affairs for 2025?
Yeah, I would think that when I look at the supply and demand balance, it's getting a little bit out of whack, right? We typically will sell, not seasonally adjusted, 1 to 1.5 million units per month. And that was pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and it's post-pandemic. Yet what you see very widely is the amount of supply, the number of inventory units on the ground. So pre-pandemic, that would be as high as 4 million units, only selling 1 to 1.5. I think 1.32 was the average pre-pandemic. So then you see inventory go below 1 million during the pandemic to about 800,000, still selling 1 million units, right? So that's where you had this really firm pricing and margin environment. And now we're back above 3 million units, but leveling off. So it seems like there were some lessons learned, like, hey, let's not run right back to 4 million units. Cost structures may influence that going forward, which is something to watch. But at 3 million units, if you can do, just quick math, 1.5 sales per month, that's a 60-day supply, which seems okay, right? So if we can live around 60 days, it's just those manufacturers that get up into the 80s and 90s because you've overproduced. In that environment, you will see incentives. The factory basically has to grease the system, keep product moving out through the retail channel so they can maintain production that they can then pass along to their retailers. So, and I have this discussion a lot too, is that inventory, a benefit or a detriment depends where you're sitting. If you're a manufacturer, it's a bad thing, right? Now you got to spend and compress your own margins, or at some point we may have to see capacity reductions, right? There's just too many units of capacity here, and we're not going to get up to those kind of 17, 18 million units again anytime soon, but we have 21 million units of capacity in North America. So I think what you have to, and then if you think about it from the dealer's perspective, well, excess inventory, it's the manufacturer, greasing the wheel a little bit. So there's money out there, and that sparks, a feeding frenzy by the consumer. And then there's transactions, which is what dealers want, right? So that excess inventory is a good thing from the dealer's perspective, basically until it isn't, right? Until everything comes crashing down and the demand side stops, and then it's really the front of the locomotive stopping, and then every car behind it just crashing into it. So there's a period, and I think we're in that period now, where the excess supply is not horrible for the manufacturers, but it's getting worse. It's good for the dealers because they're doing more, 16 million units now. But you have to watch when the incentives stop working. That's the worst case scenario.
Affordability, is that still top of mind for consumers as much as it had been in the year prior? And does that give any insight into the types of vehicles that may be moving fast off lots?
Yeah, again, when you think about that from the consumer's perspective, there's always somebody on the other side of the trade, right? So when the consumer wants affordability, the manufacturer's saying, but I lose money if I do that, right? That's why every single manufacturer, the Japan-based brands have kept their small cars and their mid-sized cars, but everybody else is out of it. You look at Ford, there's one car left, Mustang. General Motors, there's basically one car left, Corvette, right? So nobody's doing that $20,000, $25,000 price point profitably. Even the Japanese brands or somebody like Hyundai Kia, what they may be doing is to say, we want access to that first-time buyer. And we think that their ownership experience is going to be good and they're going to like the vehicle, and then we can move them up through the portfolio eventually to some profitable nameplate. But you're not making money at the bottom. Nobody is making money at the bottom of that market. And what you had was those import brands choosing to do that to create a young, not yet affluent customer base, on the hopes that someday they get to the profitable part of their portfolio. The domestic manufacturers, that distance is just too far. If you're profitable above $50,000, you don't want to start somebody at 20 and have to sell them 5 or 6 unprofitable things on the hope that someday they're in the profitable part of your portfolio. So I don't see relief from the affordability question. You'll get some manufacturers willing to lose money at the bottom of the market, but profitability won't be the motivation. It will be as an introduction to your brand.
Is there one thing you would like to leave with dealers just for 2025? What may change? Maybe ways looking at the numbers, staying competitive and profitable. What's that one area for you?
Yeah, and I think it's that revenue diversity. I think we're at the point now where the new vehicle market was so profitable and margins were great because supply and demand were in balance that you could focus all your energy there. I think 2025 starts the year of starting to think about or being in position to be in position for more margin compression because of that inventory. The used vehicle market is still undersupplied because we went through a couple of years of low volume and then not needing incentives, of which leasing is an incentive. So we go through the end of 2025. 2025 will actually be the lowest off lease return market probably ever or since the modern era. So to put that in context, in all those pre-pandemic years when new vehicle volume was 17 million units, leasing was 30% of the market. So quick math, that's 5.1 million units coming back off lease every 3 years, like in a cycle. Then you go to 2022 and it's a 13.8 or 14 million unit market total, but lease penetration was in the teens. So you had 5 million, 5 million, 5 million, and then by 2025 it goes to 2.4. So the off-lease market gets cut in half just in a couple of years, and 2025 is what I think is the bottom. And then it comes back to 3 next year. So it's going to be difficult for dealers to really cycle aggressively to the pre-owned market. It's going to be a little bit of work there to buy good inventory or to find inventory. But I think you gotta get away from just this new vehicle market. Margins are going to compress. You're going to get transactions. And the idea is, how do we earn more from the other parts of our business based on these new vehicle transactions, which should be reasonably strong, 16.2 or whatever the number is going to be for 2025.
And we mentioned 2025 a lot, Kevin. This year, the VADA 2025 convention is going to be at the Homestead. Will you be there?
I absolutely will. I will. And I'll probably even drive there because it's June. I'll put the top down, take the convertible, and put some miles on it. So very much looking forward to it. It's even better that not only is the VADA great, and I love the group and Don and everybody, but when I can drive there, because I love to drive, that's even better.
Well, we look forward to seeing you there, Kevin. Really appreciate your time. We've been speaking with Kevin Tynan, who is Director of Research at the Presidio Group. You're watching VADA Live. I'm Dan Carrigan. We'll see you next time.